Welcome to the Echoes of Ihsan podcast, and today we're going to be diving deep into Imam al-Ghazali's Death and the Afterlife.
Well, to be a little more precise, it's his book, The Remembrance of Death and the Afterlife. And, it really encourages us to look at how contemplating our own mortality can actually change the way we live now.
Yeah, that's such a heavy topic, though. Not exactly my idea of a fun time. Why does al-Ghazali think it's so important?
Well, he's not trying to be all doom and gloom. He argues that how we deal with the idea of death says a lot about our spiritual state. In fact, he divides people into three groups based on this.
Three groups. Okay, I'm listening. Tell me more.
So he talks about the people who are really into worldly things, and then you have those who are already on a spiritual path. He calls them the penitent beginners. And then there are the Gnostics who have reached a deeper level of spiritual knowledge.
So the first group, the ones all about worldly stuff, they'd just rather not think about death at all, I guess.
Exactly. They see death as like an interruption, something that takes away from their enjoyment of all good things in life. They're so busy chasing success, wealth, all that, they don't want to think about what happens when it ends.
Yeah, I can see that. But what about the second group, the penitent beginners? How do they feel about death?
For them, death is like a big motivator. They're working on themselves, trying to be better people and get closer to God. Remembering death reminds them that this life is temporary, and that they need to make the most of it.
Kind of like having a deadline, like for a big project.
Yeah,
Makes you focus.
exactly. And then you have the Gnostics, the ones with the really deep spiritual awareness. They don't see death as an ending, but as a reunion.
A reunion. Okay, I like that. What do you mean?
Al-Ghazali uses this analogy of a lover who's excitedly waiting to see their beloved. He says, a lover never forgets the time they're supposed to meet the one they love. The Gnostics, because they're so close to God, see death as finally getting to meet the divine, their ultimate beloved.
Wow, that's a completely different way of seeing it. It takes away the fear, makes you look forward to it. Are there any examples of these different views of death playing out in real life?
Oh, absolutely. Al-Ghazali talks about Hudhaifa, who was a companion of the Prophet Muhammad. When Hudhaifa was dying, he didn't fear death. He welcomed it like an old friend.
He welcomed death. That's amazing. Why did he feel that way?
His faith was so strong, he saw death as a transition from this imperfect world to being with God. He even prayed for an easy death because he was ready to leave behind all the struggles of this earthly life.
That's really powerful. Shows how strong faith can be. But for those of us who aren't at that Gnostic level, what's the lesson here?
Even if we can't be as joyful about death as Hudhaifa was, just thinking about our own mortality can be good for us. It can help us let go of worldly pleasures and concentrate on what's really important.
So it's about perspective, realizing our time is limited.
Precisely. Al-Ghazali compares it to preparing for a dangerous trip. When you know the stakes are high, you don't sweat the small stuff. You focus on what matters.
That makes sense. But how do we actually do this remembering of death? Just sit around thinking about dying.
Al-Ghazali has some advice. He says to think about people who've died, especially people we knew, picture them when they were alive, full of life, and then contrast that with them now, gone back to the earth.
It's like a guided meditation almost. Not exactly pleasant, but it would make you think about death for sure. It reminds me of that story about Jesus and the old man.
Oh, right. Yeah, that's a good one. In that story, Jesus asks God to take away the old man's hope. And without hope for the future, the old man just collapses, completely exhausted. He can't go on.
And then Jesus asks God to give the man his hope back, and he immediately jumps back up, full of energy. It's crazy how our outlook on life can change so much depending on whether we have hope or not.
Exactly. This story shows us how important it is to balance remembering death with having hope. We need to remember death to stay focused, but we also need hope to keep moving forward.
So it's about finding a balance, being aware of our mortality without letting fear take over. Now, one of the things that really stood out to me in the remembrance of death was how vividly al-Ghazali describes the actual experience of dying.
Oh, he doesn't hold back, does he? He talks about the physical signs of death based on what the Prophet Muhammad said, like your face losing color, your limbs getting cold, your lips pulling back.
He even mentions, well, let's just say things getting a bit rearranged down there. Not exactly what you'd expect in a self-help book.
Yeah.
But I guess there's a reason for those graphic descriptions.
For sure. He wants to wake us up, make us face the reality of death, but he also talks about the arrival of the angel of death, and it's not just about the physical stuff.
And that's when the faithful and the unfaithful have completely different experiences.
Exactly. For believers, the angel of death brings comfort, even relief. Al-Ghazali describes angels coming down with sweet basil and saffron, their presence bringing a sense of peace.
It's such a beautiful image. The faithful are greeted with good news, their good deeds shown to them like a beautiful bouquet. It's like a moment where everything they did right is acknowledged.
But for the unfaithful, the angel of death is terrifying, and the angels with him are, well, not so nice.
They come with clothes of fire and armor made of tar, right? Like something out of a nightmare.
Yeah, it's a way of showing the torment waiting for them. And it's not just how those angels look that's scary. Al-Ghazali says the unfaithful are shown a record of their actions, all of their bad deeds laid out. They realize they can't escape the consequences.
It's like they're being held accountable. Even though the final judgment comes later, there's this immediate reckoning. And that's where the two recording angels come in, right? The Kiram and Katibin.
Yes, the Kiramin Katibin. They've been keeping track of every single thing we do throughout our lives, every step of the way, good and bad. And when we die, they show us this complete record of our lives.
It's like a cosmic security camera that sees everything. It makes you think about how important every choice is.
Absolutely. Every choice matters. It's all being recorded for that final judgment. This reminds me of the story about Abu Huraira, one of the Prophet Muhammad's companions. When someone prayed for his burdens to be lightened, Abu Huraira actually prayed for his burdens to be heavier.
Why would he want a heavier burden?
Because he understood that those burdens were good deeds. He wanted his good deeds to outweigh the bad ones, to tip the scales in his favor on Judgment Day. He wasn't settling for just getting by. He wanted to arrive in the afterlife with a whole lot of righteousness.
That's amazing how deeply he understood the importance of good deeds. And it shows the huge difference between how the faithful and unfaithful experience the transition from this life to the next.
Exactly. The faithful see beauty and peace, while the unfaithful are faced with terror. A glimpse of the hellfire they were warned about, it becomes real for them.
Al-Ghazali's descriptions of the afterlife are certainly intense and make you think. And this leads us to the next step, life in the grave.
We tend to think of death as the end, but for Al-Ghazali, it's just the start of the afterlife, and the grave is the first stage.
So what happens in the grave, according to Al-Ghazali?
He describes the grave as a place of both potential and danger. For the faithful, it can be like a garden of paradise. But for the unfaithful, it becomes a cramped, torturous space.
And this is where the angels Munkar and Nakir come in, right? The ones who question the dead in the grave.
Exactly. They show up and ask about your beliefs, God, the Prophet Muhammad, the Islamic faith.
It's like a final exam.
Kind of. But for the faithful, it's easy. They confidently answer, and their grave expands, becoming spacious and filled with light. It's like their spirit is also expanding and finding peace.
But for the unfaithful, it's a different story.
Unfortunately, yes. They struggle to answer. They don't know the right things to say. Their grave shrinks, becoming tight and suffocating. And they're also tormented by snakes and scorpions stinging them.
Snakes and scorpions, that sounds awful. Are these literal creatures or is there more to it?
Al-Ghazali uses them as symbols for the bad things the person did while they were alive. The snakes and scorpions represent the consequences of their actions, all the pain they caused themselves and others.
It's like their own bad deeds coming back to haunt them.
Exactly. It's not about God punishing them. It's more like experiencing the natural outcome of their choices.
That's something to think about.
Yeah.
Makes you realize actions have consequences, not just in this life, but afterward too.
Exactly. And Al-Ghazali displays that there are different levels of belief about the kind of punishment in the grave, and that it might be beyond what we can imagine.
Because we can't fully grasp the afterlife with our limited human understanding.
Right. It's like trying to explain color to someone who's been blind since birth. They can get the concept, but they can't truly see it.
I like that analogy. It shows how we're limited when trying to understand the afterlife. We can only get glimpses using metaphors to make sense of something beyond us.
Exactly. And that's why Al-Ghazali says descriptions of the afterlife, whether paradise or hell, are symbolic. They capture the essence, even if we can't grasp all the details, like those old paintings of heaven and hell. They weren't literal, but they evoked strong feelings.
And speaking of feelings, I have to ask about that story about Abu Sa'id al-Kharaz in his dream.
Ah, yes. The one where his dead son tells him to let go of worldly things. It reminds us that our attachment to this world can cause us suffering in the afterlife.
He was so moved by that dream, he wouldn't even wear a shirt for 30 years. That's taking detachment to the extreme.
It is, but it illustrates the point. Being attached to things weighs us down, prevents us from fully embracing the spiritual side.
It's a reminder to keep things simple, focus on what matters. And that brings us to another interesting concept, the spirit living on after death.
It's not just our bodies decaying. Al-Ghazali says our spirits, our essence, continue to exist and can feel joy and sorrow.
So a part of us lives on after the body dies.
Yeah.
And our actions in this life affect our spirit's existence.
Exactly. He says our relationship with worldly pleasures completely flips after death. What we enjoyed here can torment us in the afterlife.
That's interesting. Something that seems enjoyable here can cause suffering later. Why is that?
Because our perspective changes. We no longer have physical bodies, so physical pleasures are different, and the things we clung to, possessions, status, temporary joys, they all lose their meaning.
It's like trying to satisfy your thirst by drinking sand.
Precisely. Holding on to those fleeting pleasures when they're empty can lead to regret and even torment.
That's a sobering thought.
Mhm.
Shows us that true happiness isn't found in material things. But if our spirits live on, what are they doing? What's it like?
That's a good question, and it gets a little complicated here. Al-Ghazali admits there are different views on what happens to the dead.
So there's no one definitive answer.
Not really. Some say the spirits sleep until Judgment Day, while others believe they experience reward or punishment right away.
So some believe in a kind of waiting period, while others believe judgment is immediate.
You could say that Al-Ghazali weighs the evidence, looking at the Quran, the Prophet's teachings, and what earlier scholars said.
And what does he conclude? Does he pick one interpretation over the other?
He ultimately says no. The spirits don't just sleep until the final judgment. He says the Quran and the Prophet's words clearly show that both the faithful and unfaithful are aware and experience things right after death.
I'm sure he has some proof for that.
He does. He mentions the story where the Prophet Muhammad tells Jabir good news about his father who died a martyr. The Prophet assures Jabir that his father is alive and well with God, able to talk and even ask to come back to this world.
That's powerful.
Yeah.
Suggests that the spirits aren't just asleep, they're aware and can act.
Exactly. And it gets even more fascinating when Al-Ghazali talks about the different things spirits can do. He says they can visit their loved ones, they know what's happening in the world they left, and they even anticipate what's coming next.
So it's not like they're just passively waiting. They're active in some way.
That's right. They're not just hanging around for Judgment Day. They're continuing to learn, grow, and experience in this new realm.
That's a deep concept. It changes how we think about death.
Hmm.
And it makes preparing for this continued existence important, making sure our spirits are ready for what's next.
It's not about fearing death, but understanding it and preparing for it. And that preparation starts now with the choices we make every day.
Al-Ghazali's The Remembrance of Death and the Afterlife is definitely something to think about. It's full of vivid descriptions, interesting stories, and deep insights that make us reconsider our relationship with death.
And it's not just about death, it's about life. It's about living to the fullest, being good people, and getting closer to God. These are things that matter to people of all faiths.
It's a timeless message. Join us next time as we continue exploring the remembrance of death and the afterlife. We'll be discussing Al-Ghazali's practical advice on how to live a meaningful life, knowing that we will die.
What I find so interesting about how Al-Ghazali approaches this is that he doesn't just present these profound ideas in some, dry philosophical way. He uses vivid stories and examples that we can all relate to bring them to life. It's like he's sitting here with us, sharing these old wisdom traditions as if they happened yesterday.
Yeah, you're so right. It's not just about abstract concepts. It's about real people dealing with life and death and trying to figure it all out.
Yeah.
And he's not just trying to scare us into being good either.
Yeah.
There's this real emphasis on God's mercy, even when he's talking about the tough parts of the afterlife.
Yeah, absolutely. He quotes a lot of verses from the Quran and sayings of the Prophet that emphasize God's forgiveness and how he's willing to accept sincere repentance. It's not about earning salvation by following strict rules perfectly. It's more about developing a heart that's focused on the divine, even when we make mistakes, because we all do.
That's good to know, honestly. Because some of those descriptions of the punishments in the afterlife are pretty intense. I can't help but picture those medieval drawings, all the fire and brimstone. But it sounds like Al-Ghazali is saying the real suffering comes from being separated from God, from realizing what we've missed because of our choices.
You've got it. It's not about some random punishment from up above. It's about the natural consequences of how we lived. If we're focused on worldly stuff, our spirit will be drawn to that even after death. And clinging to those temporary pleasures when everything's changed, when they don't really mean anything anymore, well, that's where the real suffering is.
So the takeaway for us, the living, is to start changing our focus now, right? It's about understanding that worldly things don't last and working on a deeper connection to what really does last, our relationship with God.
That's it. It's not about completely rejecting the world or living like a hermit. It's about seeing things for what they are. Enjoy the good stuff, but don't make it your only source of meaning or happiness.
When I was reading The Remembrance of Death, I noticed that Al-Ghazali talks a lot about doing good deeds. But it's not just about collecting points like it's some kind of reward system. It's about how those actions affect our hearts, who we are on the inside.
Exactly. Al-Ghazali connects doing good deeds to developing virtue. He says when we do righteous actions consistently, it actually changes our character. It's like practicing an instrument or training for a marathon. The more you do it, the stronger you become.
So, for instance, being generous isn't just something we do to please God. The act of giving itself changes something in us, makes us more compassionate and aware of others' needs.
Right, and that change on the inside is what matters most, both in this life and the next. It's about becoming the kind of person who naturally does those good things, the kind of person who reflects the divine.
Like building a spiritual foundation, brick by brick, through our actions. And those bricks, those good deeds, they can be big or small, right? It doesn't always have to be some grand gesture. Al-Ghazali seems to emphasize that even little acts of kindness matter, those seemingly insignificant moments where we choose good over bad.
You're getting at something important here. Al-Ghazali makes it clear that we're always faced with choices, moments where we can either do what God wants or go against it. And all those choices, even the small ones, add up over time and shape who we are at our core.
It's like we're creating a tapestry with every thought, word, and deed. The patterns we make, the colors we use, they all contribute to the beauty of the final result.
That's such a beautiful way to put it. And it shows the power we have in this process. We're not just passengers, we actively participate in shaping our destiny in this world and the next.
This brings up a question I've been thinking about as we dig deeper into these teachings. Al-Ghazali paints a really vivid picture of the afterlife, but it's still hard to grasp what that kind of existence would feel like. How can we, with our limited human understanding, really understand something beyond our senses?
That's the big question, isn't it? A question that's puzzled thinkers for ages. Al-Ghazali knows that our language, our concepts, our very way of seeing things are based on this world. We're trying to grasp something infinite and eternal with tools made for what's limited and temporary.
So like trying to fit an ocean in a teacup doesn't quite work. But if we can't fully understand the afterlife, what's the point of trying to describe it?
That's where symbols come in. Al-Ghazali uses metaphors, analogies, and imagery to evoke the feeling of the afterlife. He talks about gardens of paradise with rivers of milk and honey and angels with wings of light. But he's also careful to say that these are just glimpses, pointers to a reality that's beyond our comprehension.
It's like those old maps with pictures of dragons and sea monsters in uncharted areas. They didn't depict those creatures literally, but they conveyed a sense of the unknown, of the dangers and wonders beyond what was familiar.
What a great comparison. And it shows how important it is to approach these descriptions with humility, understanding that we're dealing with mysteries that might never be fully revealed to us in this life.
So it's not about getting caught up in the literal details, arguing about how many angels can fit on the head of a pin. It's about getting the deeper meaning, the message Al-Ghazali is trying to send. And that message, to me, seems to be one of hope and possibility.
You're absolutely right. While Al-Ghazali doesn't shy away from the challenges of the afterlife, his main message is encouraging. It's a call to action, an invitation to try our best in this life so we can be rewarded in the next.
And it's not just about getting into heaven. It's about transforming ourselves, becoming the kind of people who naturally want to be close to God. It's about having a heart that's full of love, compassion, and gratitude.
It's about realizing that the journey to the afterlife starts right here, right now, with every choice we make, and that's powerful and empowering.
Totally. It's like we've been given a map, a compass, everything we need to navigate this unknown territory.
Sure.
And it's up to us to use them wisely and choose the path that leads us to our ultimate goal, unity with the divine.
And as we're talking about paths and destinations, one of the most fascinating things about the remembrance of death is how Al-Ghazali explores all the different ways people experience dying. He describes the deaths of prophets, righteous leaders, and everyday people, those who were devout and those who weren't. He shows the wide range of human experience at that final moment.
Yeah, definitely not a one-size-fits-all experience. And I was really struck by how much he emphasizes the importance of dying well, being ready spiritually for that ultimate transition.
Absolutely. He emphasizes knowing what you believe, being at peace with what you've done, and having a heart full of gratitude and acceptance. He tells the story of Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, the first Umayyad Caliph. When he was dying, Muawiyah regretted not focusing on his spiritual life sooner. He said, "You've remembered your Lord, O Muawiyah, only when you're old and weak. I wish you'd remembered him when you were young and strong."
That's a wake-up call, reminding us not to wait till we're old and gray to start growing spiritually.
Exactly. And Muawiyah's story also shows how important humility is, even when we achieve power and success in this world. When he was close to death, he wished for a simpler life, a life free from the burdens of leadership. He wished he'd been a simple washerman, happy with earning his living through honest work.
That's pretty powerful, especially coming from someone who was so successful. It suggests that true fulfillment isn't about achievements, but about following God's will, no matter what our circumstances are.
Al-Ghazali gives another powerful example with the story of Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan, another Umayyad caliph. As he was dying, Abd al-Malik saw a washerman folding clothes and said he wished for a less complicated life. He wished he'd never been in power, that he'd lived a quiet and peaceful life without the challenges of leadership.
These stories really hit home that material things and accomplishments don't mean anything when you're facing death. They're like shadows that vanish when the light goes out.
Exactly. And Al-Ghazali goes even further with stories about caliphs and rulers who lose everything when they're about to die. Their wealth, their palaces, their armies, none of it goes with them to the next world.
It's like that scene in Shakespeare's Richard II, where the king, imprisoned and about to die, says, I have no name, no title, no, not that name was given me at the font, but 'tis usurped alack the heavy day that I have worn so many winters out, and know not now what name to call myself.
Wow, what a connection. It reminds us that our true identity isn't in our titles or possessions, but in our relationship with the divine. That's what sustains us in this life and the next.
And it's not just about these famous people. Al-Ghazali also tells stories about regular people, some who died peacefully and some who died with fear and regret.
That's right. He highlights the different experiences of those who got ready for death by living a good life and those who ignored their spiritual side and had to face the consequences in the afterlife.
These stories are so powerful because we can relate to them. They remind us that we're all on this journey together, and the choices we make every day affect how we'll face our own death.
It's about understanding that death isn't some abstract concept, but a reality we'll all experience. And by thinking about these stories and learning from them, we can be ready for that inevitable transition.
So it's not about obsessing over death, but about appreciating how precious life is and realizing we have the chance to make every moment count.
You said it perfectly. It's about living in the present, knowing this is the only time we have to make choices that will shape our eternal future.
And it's about developing those qualities that will help us in the afterlife. Love, compassion, generosity, humility, gratitude, and most importantly, unwavering faith in God's mercy and forgiveness.
Beautifully put. It's in these qualities, in that inner transformation, that we find true peace and fulfillment.
One thing that's really interesting is that al-Ghazali doesn't just give us one set view of the afterlife. He acknowledges that there are different schools of thought within Islam, different interpretations of what awaits us after we die.
You're right. He's not afraid to look at those different viewpoints. He examines the evidence, looks at the strengths and weaknesses of each argument. It's like he's teaching us how to approach religious knowledge with a critical eye, encouraging us to really engage with these ideas, not just accept them blindly, but think them through.
Yeah, I like that. It's refreshing to see that kind of intellectual honesty in a religious text. He's not just dictating the rules. He's bringing us into a conversation, a journey of understanding where reason and faith go hand in hand.
Exactly. He's acknowledging that these are complex issues and there's room for different perspectives. He doesn't shy away from tough questions or admit when things are uncertain, and that's what makes his work so compelling. It's not about blind faith, it's about thoughtful exploration.
This open-minded approach makes me think about something. We've talked a lot about what happens to the faithful and the unfaithful in the afterlife. But what about those who are somewhere in between? What about the people who lived good lives but weren't perfect? What about those who struggled with their faith and maybe had more questions than answers? Where do they fit in?
That's a great question, and it's something that al-Ghazali tackles head-on in his work. He knows that not everyone fits perfectly into the believer or unbeliever boxes. Human experience is so vast and diverse, there's a whole spectrum of spiritual understanding. And God, being infinitely merciful and just, considers all of that.
So it's not like a simple pass-fail judgment. There's room for nuance, for individual circumstances.
Absolutely. God judges each person based on their own path, taking into account their struggles, their triumphs, their sincerity, their efforts, and their intentions, even if they weren't perfect.
That's good to hear. Because honestly, who among us hasn't made mistakes or questioned things along the way?
We're all human, and al-Ghazali reminds us that God understands our weaknesses. He doesn't expect us to be flawless. What matters is the direction we're heading in, the effort we're putting in to align ourselves with his will.
It's not about being perfect. It's about trying to be better than we were yesterday.
Exactly. It's about constant growth, about always striving to improve ourselves, even if we mess up sometimes.
So even if we're not 100% certain in our faith, even if we have doubts and questions. The most important thing is to keep moving forward on that spiritual path, to keep learning and refining our intentions.
That's it. And al-Ghazali gives us a lot of practical advice on how to do that. He talks about the importance of prayer, asking for forgiveness, doing acts of charity and kindness, being around good people, studying the scriptures, and reflecting on our own mortality.
It's like he's giving us a spiritual toolbox, everything we need to deal with the challenges of life and prepare for what comes after.
You could put it that way. And this toolbox isn't just for Muslims, it's for anyone who wants to find meaning and purpose in life. Al-Ghazali's insights go beyond religion. They speak to that human desire for connection, for something that lasts longer than the temporary pleasures of this world.
That's what's been so powerful about this deep dive into the remembrance of death and the afterlife. It's not about dwelling on death, but about waking up to how precious life is and the opportunity we have to make choices that will shape our eternal future.
It's about realizing that death isn't the end, but a transition to another way of being. And by getting ready for that transition, by developing the qualities that will serve us well in the afterlife, we can actually find peace and fulfillment right now.
As we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with a powerful question from al-Ghazali's book. It's a question that's both challenging and thought-provoking. If you were to visit your own grave tonight, what would it say to you?
Wow, that's powerful. To stand there, facing our own mortality, what story would our life tell? What legacy would we leave behind?
It makes us step back from our daily worries, rethink our priorities, and make sure what we do aligns with what we truly value.
It reminds us that the journey to the afterlife starts right here, right now, with every choice we make. We have a responsibility to make sure those choices lead us to a place of peace, joy, and eternal happiness.
Thanks for joining us on this exploration of Imam al-Ghazali's The Remembrance of Death in the Afterlife. We hope it's inspired you to think about your own path and make choices that bring you closer to the divine.
May peace, mercy, and blessings be upon you.